So I'm now going to talk a little bit about reading and writing. And I think that I have been a writer all my life because I've been a reader all my life. So this part is going to be a bit show and tell. So I'm going to start off with Bunnikin's Picnic Party, my most important influence. This was, as you can see, a little ladybird book, and it's in rhyme. It begins, Mrs. Bunnikin was darning with a stocking in her hand. In came Bunnikins, her youngest, said a picnic would be grand. And the reason I think this is important is that before I could read, when I was about 3, I knew it by heart all the way through. And I got to love the music and the rhythm of words, the rhyme of it. It's also got a fantastic narrative arc. You know, they go on the picnic, things go wrong, but finally everything is found and made well, and there's a happy ending. So I think I learned a lot of the basics from Bunnikin's Picnic Party. I was lucky because I grew up in a house where there were books, and very early on I found Paul Graves' Golden Treasury, which was a poetry collection, first published in 1861, but my edition is 1926, or rather my dad's. I've written my name in the front of it, and he's written stolen from her father, given to him on his 3rd wedding anniversary. So there was poetry in the house, and you can see the influence of that really early on. I have lots of these little books. I was starting to collect my own poetry into books from the age of 9, and you can see the influence of Paul Grave from as I say, the age of 9. Where's that page gone? I'm so sorry. So the swan at eventide glides to the other side of the moonlit lake, of what poets spake. So I'd obviously got some idea of rhyme, but I didn't know it had to come at the end of the lines, and well, it doesn't really. You can also see an influence there, I think, in that old-fashioned language of I went to Sunday school, and the fantastic rhythms of the King James Bible and hymns, I think, made their way into my writing. I also was lucky enough to be taken to the library, and we had a weekly trip to the library, and I would come back with an armful of books, which I would read during the week. My favourite was Enid Blyton, much maligned these days because of the paucity of her vocabulary, but I don't think it did me any harm, and I got to love books and love that diving in and being part of another world. Also things like The Family from One End Street, which was about working class people, really unusual story about working class people for its time. I loved Anne of Green Gables because she had a vivid imagination, and that was okay. I loved Little Women because Jo was a journalist and a writer, and it told me that women could do those sort of things. There used to be a thing called reciting poetry, and now children again learn a lot of poetry by heart, and I think that's enormously good for embedding it. And I remember learning a long poem by Tennyson called The Lady of Shalott when I was about 11. I was also writing a whole variety of things. I wrote plays, which the teachers allowed me to perform at school. I wrote poetry. I wrote a diary. I kept a diary from the age of 11 to 21. When I went to secondary school, there wasn't any teen fiction at that point, but I graduated to the classics and had Jane Eyre taken away from me, confiscated from me in a physics lesson for reading it under the desk. We wrote things in those days called compositions, which were sort of essays, and also there was story writing in the curriculum right from the start, and that was a marvelous thing. When I was 14, I had an English teacher called Grant Frew who told me to stop doing rhyme and meter in my poetry because it was very old-fashioned, and And I do feel that's a shame, because I think I had a really natural facility for it, and now I have to work at it much harder. There were also fantastic song lyrics, of course, with amazing metaphors. Eleanor Rigby waits by the window, wearing a smile that she keeps in a jar by the door. Or, I'm on your side when times get tough and friends just can't be found. Like a bridge over troubled water, I will lay me down. So music, Marvin Gaye, Leonard Cohen, Van Morrison. I discovered that Leonard Cohen had published his poetry, and that again was sort of food to me and help for me. There was a fantastic collection called The Mersey Sound, Penguin Modern Poets 10. And I do remember on a geography field trip, one of the boys memorably, as a forfeit in the game, one of the boys memorably coming out of a wardrobe in his Union Jack underpants, reciting a poem, Roger McGough poem from the Mersey Sound. I loved films when I loved the film of Dr. Zhivago and discovered Pasternak's poetry, and all this time I was writing poetry. I was collecting up the best and putting them into notebooks. But I didn't know what else to do with them. I did come across one poetry journal, and I tried to get published. I sent some poetry to them, and I got my first rejection. It was fairly kindly, but I stopped at that point. I thought, no, I'm not gonna let myself be rejected like this again. I was reading my way through Thomas Hardy, through the Brontes, George Eliot. O-level and A-level introduced me to Jane Austen, to the metaphysical poets, and I began writing longer and longer pieces of fiction. I went to university in Cardiff and did a traditional English degree, which took you all the way through from the Anglo-Saxon poetry up to the 20th century. And by now I was also reading for pleasure. I was reading contemporary novelists, Angela Carter, John Fowles. I discovered, as part of my course, the American literature introduced me to Emily Dickinson, who is still one of my very favourite poets, to Robert Frost, to Edward Thomas. And I wrote my first full-length novel. I found this under the bed, all typed, of course, not word processed, and there it will go back under the bed after today's session for posterity, because it's probably rubbish. Then I joined a newspaper. I got a job as a trainee journalist on a paper in Devon, and then moved to one in London, and almost stopped writing fiction and poetry and my diary at this point. Somehow the writing of stories for the newspaper was enough to fulfill the need to write, although I did write a pantomime. I then went to work at the BBC and was a documentary producer for the BBC. And during that time, I wasn't writing much fiction or poetry either. And again, I think the need to write was being met by my job. Then I was lucky enough to have two daughters, 3 years apart, and I began writing children's stories. And then the next thing to be published, or the first thing to be published of that, was a story in the Story of the Year. I wrote a comic novel, unpublished, about my experiences as a journalist, influenced by Tom Sharp. And in 1988, I began teaching journalism, teaching writing for the media, teaching creative writing. And then I decided that I needed another qualification, so I did a PhD in creative writing. And during that, I wrote 2 novels, mainly because I'd written one and I didn't know that that was enough. But I wrote 2 novels, including one which was later published. And then towards the end, I started to write poetry again, because after writing that great big thing, it was just such a joy to have words that I could hold in my hands, small number of words. I then entered some poems for a competition, and I won. And I won £500 for my poems, and they were published. And that gave me such a shot in the arm. I thought, oh, okay, maybe I can do this. So then I went on, and I don't know how many thousand poems I've now had printed, had in journals, but I went on and had, well, 5 collections, 6 if you count the first pamphlet, 7 if you count a e-zine online download. So my poetry has really been my biggest form of publication, and that in addition, of course, to publishing lots and lots of poems in little magazines.